The convoy had stopped moving. 3 Humvees sat motionless on the dusty road, their engines still running, exhaust mixing with the desert heat that rose in shimmering waves. Inside the lead vehicle, Colonel Marcus Hartwell adjusted his Kevlar vest and checked his watch for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. The radio crackled with overlapping voices, reports from different sectors, none of them good news. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind a crumbling stone wall, approximately 200 meters from the road, Aina Delacroix pressed her back against the weathered surface and counted the seconds between rifle shots. 7, 6, 8. The pattern was inconsistent, which meant the shooters were either poorly trained or deliberately varying their timing to avoid detection. She suspected the latter. Her uniform bore no rank insignia. Her weapon had been confiscated 6 months ago. According to official records, she wasn't supposed to be here at all. But as Colonel Hartwell's voice cut through the radio static, calling for immediate extraction while his security detail argued over protocol, Aina realized that sometimes the people who aren't supposed to be somewhere are exactly the ones who need to be. The motor pool at forward, operating base meridian hummed with the steady rhythm of maintenance work. Air compressors hissed in short bursts. Wrenches clanged against metal. Somewhere near the back fence, a generator coughed to life after what sounded like its 4th attempt. Aina Delacroix knelt beside a stripped-down engine block, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she rebuilt the carburetor, assembly piece by piece. Her workstation was tucked between 2 larger repair bays, close enough to hear the conversations but far enough away that no one expected her to participate. The space was organized with military precision, tools arranged by size and function, parts bins labeled with hand-printed tags. A coffee-stained manual lay open to a page covered in penciled notes and corrections, adjustments she'd made to the standard procedures based on 3 years of field experience. The khaki uniform she wore carried no unit patches, no campaign ribbons, no indication of rank or specialization. Where most soldiers displayed their achievements, Aina's sleeves were blank. Clean-pressed fabric with nothing to distinguish her from a recruit fresh out of basic training. The only personal item visible was a small digital multimeter clipped to her belt. Its display dark but ready. Sergeant First Class Bobby Henriksen wandered over from the hydraulics bay, wiping grease off his hands with a red shop rag. He was a large man with a perpetual squint and the kind of easy confidence that came from 15 years of fixing things that other people had broken. His uniform, unlike Aina's, told a story. Airborne wings. Combat engineer badge. Deployment patches from 3 different theaters. Are you still working on that temperamental piece of junk? He asked, nodding toward the engine. Johnson's been trying to get that thing to run clean for 2 weeks. Aina didn't look up from the carburetor float she was adjusting. The float was sticking. Fuel mixture running too rich. I should be fine now. Should be, Henriksen repeated with a grin. That's what Johnson said when he handed it off to you yesterday. That's what Rodriguez said when he gave up on it last week. That's what 3 different mechanics have said about that engine since it came in here. She set down her screwdriver and finally looked at him. It'll run, if you say so. He tucked the rag into his back pocket. The question is, will it run when someone needs it to? Out there, under pressure, when the bullets start flying and there's no time to fiddle with the settings. The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't really about the engine. They both knew that. It was about reliability, about trust, about whether someone who'd been stripped of rank and reassigned to motor pool duty could still be counted on when things got serious. Aina picked up a different tool, a needle-nose pliers, and resumed her work. Guess we'll find out. Henriksen studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged and walked back toward his own bay. Their conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but Aina knew it would be repeated. Henriksen would mention it to Staff Sergeant Williams during the afternoon break. Williams would bring it up with Master Sergeant Chen at the end of the shift briefing. By tomorrow morning, the entire motor pool would know that Aina Delacruz had made another one of her quiet claims about fixing something that couldn't be fixed. The problem was, she had a habit of being right. Across the bay, Private First Class Danny Morrison was struggling with a transmission rebuild that should have been routine. The manual lay open beside him, but he kept looking up from the pages with frustration creasing his forehead. Aina could see the issue from where she sat. The torque converter wasn't seated properly because he'd installed the pump backwards. A 10-minute fix if you knew what to look for. A 3-hour nightmare if you didn't. She watched him work for another few minutes, then quietly stood and walked over to his station. Morrison looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from frustration to something that might have been hope. "Hey, Aina, do you know anything about automatic transmissions?" She glanced at the scattered parts, the reversed pump, the manual that was open to the wrong section entirely. "I'm supposed to have this thing buttoned up by 1400, but I can't get the converter to line up right. The splines keep binding up." Aina picked up the pump assembly and turned it over in her hands. The part was clean, undamaged, perfectly functional. Just installed backwards. She could have pointed out the error directly, saved Morrison an hour of continued frustration. Instead, she set the pump down and flipped through the manual until she found the correct diagram. "Try this page," she said, pointing to the proper illustration. Sometimes the perspective in the other drawings can be misleading. Morrison looked at the page, then at his partially assembled transmission, then back at the page. She could see the moment of recognition in his eyes. Oh, damn. I had the whole thing upside down." "Happens to everyone," Aina said, though they both knew it happened to Morrison more often than most. She walked back to her own station without another word. 20 minutes later, she heard the distinctive sound of a transmission cycling through its gears properly. Morrison didn't thank her directly, but she caught him glancing in her direction with something that looked like gratitude mixed with embarrassment. The afternoon shift change brought a different energy to the motor pool. The day crew finished their projects with the hurried efficiency of people eager to be elsewhere. Conversations became louder, more casual. Someone had brought a portable radio, and classic rock played softly from a toolbox near the main entrance. Aina continued working on the carburetor as the noise level increased around her. She preferred the evening shift anyway, fewer interruptions, less conversation. Time to focus on the details that made the difference between a repair that held and one that failed when you needed it most. Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Vance emerged from the administrative office, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent too much time dealing with paperwork and not enough time with actual machinery. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that missed very little. Vance walked through the bay with the measured pace of an inspection, checking on progress, making notes, occasionally stopping to ask questions about timeline or parts availability. She paused at Morrison's station long enough to verify that his transmission work was back on track, then continued toward Aina's corner of the bay. "How's the engine coming along, Delacruz?" Aina gestured toward the reassembled carburetor. "Fuel. System's clean. Timing set. Should fire up without issues." Vance made a note on her clipboard. "Johnson's going to want to test it before we release it back to the unit. You know how he is about quality control." "I know how he is about covering his ass," Aina replied quietly. It wasn't insubordinate, exactly. Just honest in a way that made Vance pause and look at her more carefully. Chief warrant officers had seen enough politics and bureaucracy to recognize the difference between someone making excuses and someone stating facts. "Johnson's got 23 years in," Vance said finally. He's learned to be careful about what gets his signature on it. And I've got 3 years in this motor pool. Aina replied. I've learned to be careful about what gets my hands on it. Another pause. Vance clicked her pen twice, a nervous habit that Aina had observed during previous inspections. You used to work on more than engines. It wasn't a question. Vance had access to Aina's personnel file, which meant she knew about the court-martial, the reduction in rank, the reassignment from combat engineering to motor pool maintenance. She knew about the insubordination charge that had effectively ended Aina's military career trajectory before it really began. Used to work on a lot of things, Aina confirmed. Explosive ordnance disposal, that's specialized work. Different kinds of problem solving. Vance made another note, though Aina couldn't tell if it was about the engine or about something else entirely. Same principles though. Attention to detail. Understanding how systems work. What happens when they don't? Aina set down her wrench and looked directly at the chief warrant officer. Is there something specific you need to know about the engine? No, the engine's fine. I'm sure it'll run exactly like you said it would. Vance tucked the pen behind her ear. I'm just curious about someone who can rebuild a carburetor with her eyes closed but somehow couldn't follow a direct order from her commanding officer. The motor pool seemed to get quieter, though Aina knew that was probably her imagination. Morrison was still working on his transmission. Henriksen was still cursing at whatever hydraulic component had decided to fight him. The radio was still playing the same classic rock station. Orders should make sense, Aina said finally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not your call to make, wasn't my call. But it was my signature on the disposal report. My certification that the area was clear. It's hard to sign something when you know it's not true. Vance studied her for a long moment. The investigation concluded that your commanding officer's assessment was correct. The area was declared safe. No remaining ordnance found. No remaining ordnance found that week, Aina corrected. Found plenty the week after. Found enough to level half a city block. Pure speculation on your part. Educated guess based on blast patterns, soil displacement, and fragmentation analysis. But sure, speculation. The conversation had moved beyond professional courtesy into something more personal. Vance had initiated it, but Aina wasn't backing down. She'd been through this same discussion with 3 different officers over the past 6 months. The facts never changed. Her conclusions never changed. The only thing that varied was how long it took for the officer to decide whether she was stubborn, insubordinate, or simply right. You could have filed your concerns through proper channels, Vance said. Could have requested a second assessment. Could have documented your disagreement without refusing to sign the report. Could have done a lot of things. Choose to do the right thing instead. The right thing costs you your rank, cost you your specialty, cost you any chance of advancement or transfer out of this assignment. Aina picked up her wrench again. Cost me some things, saved some others. Vance made one final note on her clipboard, then turned to leave. She'd taken 3 steps before she paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Delacroix, I've read your file. All of it, including the classified addendum that came down 2 weeks after your court-martial. The area you refused to clear, the one your CO insisted was safe, Aina waited. IED detonated. Exactly where you said it would. Took out an entire patrol. 6 casualties. Vance's voice was quiet now, almost conversational. Turns out your educated guess was pretty damn educated. She walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Aina alone with her engine and the knowledge that sometimes being right was the most expensive thing you could be. The motor pool began to empty as the day shift ended. Conversations trailed off. Equipment was secured. The radio was turned off, leaving only the ambient noise of the base beyond the fence line. Aina continued working as the shadows lengthened, making final adjustments to the carburetor, checking connections, ensuring that every component was exactly where it needed to be. She didn't work fast. Speed had never been her strength. What she had was thoroughness, an ability to see problems that others missed, a willingness to take the time necessary to do things correctly the first time, even when doings correctly meant challenging authority or refusing orders that didn't make. Sensed out at 1847 hours, she finished the final adjustment and stepped back from the engine. Tomorrow morning, Johnson would arrive with his checklist and his skepticism. He would run the engine through its diagnostic sequence, looking for problems that weren't there. He would find none. The engine would run cleanly, efficiently, exactly as specified in the manual, and then he would sign the release form and send the repaired vehicle back to its unit, where it would serve reliably until the next scheduled maintenance cycle. Aina would get no credit for the repair. Her name would appear nowhere on the paperwork. Johnson would add another successful completion to his record, and Aina would move on to the next broken piece of equipment that needed fixing. She gathered her tools methodically, placing each one in its designated spot in her kit. The work area was left cleaner than she'd found it, a habit developed during her time in explosive ordnance disposal, where leaving debris behind could be fatal. Some practices were hard to break, even when the stakes were lower. As she prepared to leave, Aina noticed that the transmission Morrison had been working on was still partially disassembled. He'd solved the immediate problem with the pump installation, but hadn't finished the reassembly process. It would take him most of tomorrow to complete the work. Assuming he didn't run into any additional complications, she looked at the scattered parts, the open manual, the tools left exactly where Morrison had abandoned them when his shift ended. It would take her perhaps 30 minutes to finish the job properly. 30 minutes to save Morrison several hours of frustration and ensure that another vehicle was returned to service without delay. Aina checked the time, considered her options, then walked over to Morrison's station and quietly began assembling the transmission components in their proper sequence. No one was watching. No one would know. Morrison would arrive tomorrow morning to find his project completed and would probably assume he'd made more progress than he remembered. The work was routine, familiar. Aina's hands moved with the same precise efficiency she'd demonstrated on her own engine, each component fitted and secured according to specifications that she knew by memory. As she worked, she thought about Chief Warrant Officer Vance's parting comment about the IED that had detonated exactly where Aina had predicted it would. 6 casualties. Aina wondered if they'd been soldiers like Morrison. Young, eager, doing their best with the training and knowledge they'd been given. Following orders. Trusting their leadership. Relying on someone else's assessment that the area was safe. She finished the transmission assembly at 19:23 hours, cleaned Morrison's tools, and left his workstation exactly as organized as her own. Tomorrow morning, he would find it completed project and assume he'd somehow forgotten the final steps of his own work. Aina would say nothing to correct this assumption. The base was settling into its evening rhythm as she finally left the motor pool. Guard rotations changing, mess hall serving dinner, officers heading to briefings that would determine tomorrow's operations. Aina walked toward her quarters, past conversations she wasn't part of, past soldiers who nodded politely but didn't really see her. Her uniform still carried no rank insignia. Her file still contained a court-martial record for insubordination. According to official metrics, she was a failed soldier relegated to basic maintenance duties until her enlistment ended. But in the motor pool, engines ran cleanly after she touched them. Transmissions shifted smoothly. Vehicles returned to service without unexpected failures. Problems were solved quietly, efficiently, without fanfare or recognition. Aina Delacroix had learned to find purpose in work that others considered punishment. She had developed skills that went unnoticed but kept people alive. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she suspected that her real test was still coming. The pre-dawn hours at Forward Operating Base Meridian belonged to a different world. Security patrols moved like shadows between buildings. Communications equipment hummed with overnight message traffic from higher headquarters. In the distance, the rumble of supply convoys could be heard approaching the main gate, their headlights cutting through the desert darkness like moving stars. Aina emerged from her quarters at 0445, dressed in physical training gear that had seen better days. Her running shoes were worn but meticulously maintained, the treads cleaned of yesterday's dust and debris. She carried a small notebook wrapped in a waterproof cover, its pages filled with handwritten observations and calculations that no regulation required her to keep. The running route she'd established months ago took her along the base perimeter, past guard towers and communication arrays, through sections where most personnel rarely ventured. It wasn't the official PT course used by organized unit runs. It was longer, more challenging, and it offered views of the surrounding terrain that weren't available from the standard facilities. As she ran, Aina studied the landscape beyond the wire, rolling hills dotted with sparse vegetation, dry creek beds that could conceal movement, rock formations that provided natural cover and elevated positions. The kind of terrain analysis that had once been her specialty, before a single moment of moral clarity had redefined her entire military career. At the halfway point of her route, she paused beside a maintenance shed that housed backup generators for the communications center. The building was unremarkable, one of dozens of similar structures scattered throughout the base. But Aina had noticed something during previous runs that others had missed. The fuel lines running from the main storage tanks to this particular generator showed signs of stress. Not visible damage, nothing that would trigger a maintenance request. Just subtle indicators that the system was operating outside optimal parameters. Slight discoloration where fuel vapors had escaped. Corrosion patterns around joints that suggested pressure variations. She pulled out her notebook and made a quick sketch of the fuel line configuration, noting the specific joints that showed stress indicators. It wasn't her responsibility. The cuckoo communication center had its own maintenance staff, their own inspection schedules. But Aina had learned that problems rarely announced themselves with obvious symptoms. Usually, they whispered through details that busy people overlooked. The remaining portion of her run took her past the vehicle staging area, where tomorrow's convoy operations were being prepared. Even at this early hour, soldiers were conducting pre-mission inspections, checking tire pressure, testing communication equipment, loading ammunition and supplies according to carefully planned manifests. Aina slowed her pace as she passed the staging area, not to observe the preparations directly, but to listen. Radio checks between vehicle commanders, brief discussions about route timing and checkpoint procedures, the kind of operational details that painted a picture of missions she was no longer cleared to participate in. She completed her run at 0537, stretching beside the motor pool fence as the base began its transition from night to day operations. The eastern horizon was showing the first hints of dawn, a pale line of light that would soon explode into the punishing heat of another desert day. Inside her quarters, Aina showered quickly and changed into her work uniform. The routine was identical each morning. Check for messages she didn't expect to receive. Review the motor pool assignment board she couldn't access remotely. Prepare for another day of fixing problems while being reminded that she'd created the biggest problem of all by refusing to ignore a safety issue. Her personal gear occupied a small corner of the quarters. Military regulations didn't permit much in the way of personal possessions, but Aina had managed to accumulate a collection of items that reflected her true interests. Technical manuals that went beyond standard military publications. A set of precision measuring tools purchased with her own money, a laptop computer that contained engineering software she'd acquired during her explosive ordnance disposal training. The laptop was perhaps her most valuable possession, not because of its monetary worth, but because of the information it contained. Detailed analyses of blast patterns from previous missions, calculations for shaped charge effects under various environmental conditions, photographs and measurements from dozens of improvised explosive devices that she'd successfully neutralized. Before her career was derailed, Ina opened the computer and navigated to a folder labeled Theoretical Studies. Inside were documents that no regulation specifically prohibited her from maintaining, but which would certainly raise questions if discovered during a routine inspection. Blast effect modeling for various explosive types, structural vulnerability, assessments for common building materials used in the region, tactical considerations for urban explosive ordnance disposal operations. She'd created these documents during the months following her court-martial, partly as an intellectual exercise and partly as a way to maintain skills that she was no longer officially authorized to use. The work was thorough, methodical, based on hard data rather than speculation. It represented hundreds of hours of research and analysis that no one had requested and no one would ever see. One particular document caught her attention this morning. A study she'd compiled on secondary explosive devices, the IEDs designed to detonate after initial response teams arrived at the scene of a primary explosion. These devices represented a particularly sophisticated threat, requiring detailed knowledge of both explosive principles and tactical response patterns. Ina scrolled through pages of technical diagrams and timing calculations. Secondary devices were typically positioned to target specific personnel: EOD specialists, medical personnel, commanding officers. The placement patterns followed predictable logic based on human psychology and standard operating procedures. People responded to emergencies in consistent ways, which made them vulnerable to attacks designed around those patterns. She paused at a section dealing with remote detonation methods. Radio-controlled devices had become increasingly common, partly because they offered flexibility in timing, but mainly because they allowed attackers to observe the response and select the most valuable targets. A radio-controlled secondary device could wait until the highest-ranking officer arrived at the scene before detonating. The implications were troubling. Ina closed the laptop and secured it in her footlocker, but the concepts remained in her thoughts as she prepared for the workday. Secondary devices, target selection. The vulnerability of leaders who felt compelled to personally assess dangerous situations. At 0630, she arrived at the motor pool to find Chief Warrant Officer Vance waiting beside her workstation. This was unusual. Vance typically conducted her inspections later in the morning, after the day shift had settled into their routines. Her presence at this hour suggested something beyond routine oversight. "Morning, Delacrale. Need to discuss a special project with you." Ina set down her toolkit and waited for details. Special projects in the motor pool usually meant rush jobs for vehicles that had broken down during operations or modifications, requested by units with specific mission requirements. "Convoy escort vehicle," Vance continued. "Armored Humvee that's been having electrical problems. Intermittent power loss to the communication systems. Unit needs it operational by tomorrow." "Morning," Ina nodded. Electrical problems were often the most challenging to diagnose because they could be caused by dozens of different factors. Loose connections, corroded contacts, damaged wiring harnesses, failing components. The intermittent nature of this particular problem would make it even more difficult to isolate. "Vehicles parked in Bay 7, Vance said. "Johnson looked at it yesterday and couldn't reproduce the problem. Rodriguez spent 3 hours with it last week, same result. Runs fine on the bench. Fails unpredictably in the field." "Any pattern to the failures?" Ina asked. "Not that anyone's been able to identify. Sometimes it happens during startup. Sometimes after the vehicle's been running for an hour. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Vance handed her a folder containing previous maintenance records. The unit commander specifically requested our best technician. Ania accepted the folder without commenting on the irony that their best technician was someone who'd been demoted for insubordination. She opened the maintenance records and began scanning the previous attempts at diagnosis. Johnson's notes were thorough, but unimaginative. He'd checked all the obvious potential causes: battery condition, alternator output, fuse box integrity, major wiring harness connections, all tested within normal parameters. Rodriguez's approach had been more systematic, testing individual circuit branches and documenting voltage readings at various points in the electrical system. Also normal. "What kind of mission profile?" Ana asked. "Convoy escort. High priority. Cargo runs to a forward outpost. The route takes them through some challenging terrain." Vance paused. "This isn't just about getting a vehicle running, Delacroix. There are people depending on reliable communications out there." The comment carried additional weight beyond its obvious meaning. Vance was reminding Ana that her work had consequences beyond the motor pool. That soldiers in dangerous situations needed to trust their equipment absolutely. That a communication failure at the wrong moment could cost lives. Ana walked to Bay 7 and began her initial assessment of the armored Humvee. The vehicle was larger and more heavily protected than standard models, with additional armor plating and specialized communication equipment mounted throughout the passenger compartment. The electrical system was correspondingly more complex, with multiple power distribution points and redundant circuitry designed to maintain critical functions, even if primary systems failed. She spent the first hour simply studying the vehicle's configuration. Not testing anything, not taking measurements, just understanding how the various systems interconnected. The communication equipment included standard military radios, a satellite communication system, and electronic countermeasures designed to defeat radio-controlled explosive devices. That last component caught her attention. Electronic countermeasures systems consumed significant power and generated substantial electromagnetic interference. If the system wasn't properly shielded or grounded, it could interfere with other electrical components in unpredictable ways. Ana retrieved her multimeter and began tracing the power supply circuits for the countermeasures system. The installation looked professional, with proper connectors and appropriate gauge wiring. But as she followed the ground connections, she noticed something that the previous technicians had missed. The countermeasures system shared a common ground point with the communication radios. Under most circumstances, this wouldn't cause problems. But if the countermeasure system activated while the radios were transmitting, the resulting electromagnetic pulse could create a momentary voltage spike that would reset the radio systems. She documented her findings in the maintenance log, including detailed measurements and a theory for the failure mechanism. Then she began the process of installing a separate ground circuit for the countermeasure system, a modification that would eliminate the electrical interference without affecting the performance of either system. The work required precision and patience. Each connection had to be properly secured and tested. The new ground wire had to be routed to avoid interference with existing systems, while maintaining proper electromagnetic shielding. It was the kind of detailed, methodical work that Ana had always excelled at, even when her career goals had involved much more dramatic applications of technical knowledge. As she worked, other motor pool personnel occasionally wandered past Bay 7 to observe her progress. Word had spread that Ana was working on the problematic convoy escort vehicle, and there was obvious curiosity about whether she would succeed where others had failed. Sergeant Henriksen appeared around mid-morning, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing his usual expression of friendly skepticism. "Heard you think you found the gremlin in the electrical system," he said. "Think I found a gremlin," Ana corrected. "Might be others." Johnson's betting you won't have it figured out by the end of shift. Says intermittent electrical problems are just about impossible to solve without replacing half the wiring harness. Ana didn't look up from the connection she was securing. Johnson might be right, but you don't think so. I think the problem's probably simpler than it looks. Usually it is. Henriksen sipped his coffee and watched her work for a few minutes. You know, back when I was stationed in Germany, we had a tracked vehicle that kept losing power to its main gun systems. 3 different mechanics worked on it over 6 months. Replaced everything twice. Finally brought in a specialist from the manufacturer. Ana continued working but indicated she was listening. Turned out to be a loose bolt on the main battery terminal. Half a turn with a wrench fixed 6 months of problems. Henriksen chuckled. A specialist charged the Army $15,000 to tighten 1 bolt. Sometimes the simple explanations are the hardest to see, Ana agreed. Sometimes the people looking for simple explanations aren't allowed to find them, Henriksen replied, his tone shifting slightly. Sometimes the system works better when problems stay complicated. The comment hung in the air between them. Ana knew that Henriksen was referring to more than just vehicle maintenance. He was talking about institutional resistance to solutions that came from unexpected sources, about bureaucratic preferences for complexity over clarity, about the military's tendency to distrust answers that came from people who'd been labeled as troublemakers. She completed the ground wire installation and began testing the modified electrical system. Initial results were promising. The communication. Radios maintained stable power even when the countermeasure system cycled through its startup sequence. But the real test would come under operational conditions, when the vehicle was subjected to the vibrations, temperature variations, and electromagnetic environment of actual convoy operations. Ana spent the afternoon conducting increasingly demanding tests of the electrical system. She ran the engine at various RPMs while operating all electrical components simultaneously. She activated the countermeasure system repeatedly while monitoring power distribution throughout the vehicle. She even used a heat gun to simulate extreme temperature conditions that could affect electrical connections. By 1500 hours, she was confident that the ground wire modification had solved the intermittent power loss problem. But confidence wasn't the same as certainty, and certainty was what convoy operations required. Ana made a decision that went beyond her official responsibilities. She requested permission to take the vehicle on a test drive around the base perimeter. Not just a trip around the motor pool, but a comprehensive operational test that would subject the electrical system to realistic conditions. Chief Warrant Officer Vance initially hesitated, pointing out that Ana wasn't authorized to operate armored vehicles outside the motor pool area. "I can't officially approve that," Vance said. "Finally, but I can't be everywhere at once. If someone happened to take an unauthorized test drive to verify a critical repair, and if that test drive happened to confirm that the vehicle was fully operational, and if that person happened to return the vehicle with a complete written report, well, sometimes we have to balance regulations against mission requirements." Ana understood. Vance was giving her unofficial permission to conduct the test while maintaining plausible deniability if questions were raised later. It was the kind of practical leadership that Ana respected, even if it operated in the gray areas between official policy and operational necessity. At 15:30, she drove the armored Humvee through the base gate and onto the perimeter road. The test route she'd planned would take approximately 45 minutes and would include various terrain conditions, communication checks with the base radio center, and controlled activation of the countermeasure system. As the vehicle climbed into the hills surrounding the base, Ana monitored the electrical systems continuously. Radio communications remained clear and consistent. Power distribution stayed within normal parameters. The countermeasure system activated and deactivated without affecting other components. But more importantly, she was conducting a different kind of test. Aina was observing the surrounding terrain with the eye of someone who understood how explosive devices were employed tactically. She noted positions that offered concealment for observation posts, locations where command detonated. Devices could be effectively employed. Terrain features that would channel vehicle movement into predictable patterns. It was an analysis she wasn't authorized to conduct, using skills she wasn't supposed to possess anymore. But as she completed the test drive and returned to the base, Aina carried with her a detailed mental map of vulnerabilities and threats that could prove valuable if circumstances ever required it. The armored Humvee performed flawlessly during the test. All electrical systems functioned as designed. The communication equipment maintained clear contact with base operations throughout the route. Aina's modification had solved the intermittent power loss problem completely. She parked the vehicle in Bay 7 and spent another hour documenting her findings. The maintenance report included technical details about the ground wire installation, test results demonstrating system reliability, and recommendations for similar modifications to other vehicles with comparable electronic countermeasures systems. What the report didn't include was her assessment of route security vulnerabilities, her observations about potential ambush positions, or her growing concern that convoy operations in the region were following predictable patterns that made them vulnerable to sophisticated attacks. As she secured her tools and prepared to end her workday, Aina reflected on the contradiction inherent in her current situation. She possessed skills and knowledge that could contribute significantly to mission success and personnel safety. But those same skills and knowledge were considered dangerous by an institution that valued compliance over competence. The armored Humvee was ready for tomorrow's convoy mission. Its electrical systems would function reliably under operational conditions. The soldiers who depended on those communication systems would have the equipment they needed to coordinate their movements and call for support if necessary. Aina had done her job well. She'd solved the complex technical problem that had defeated other mechanics. She'd conducted thorough testing to ensure reliability. She'd documented her work completely and professionally. But as she walked toward her quarters, Aina couldn't shake the feeling that fixing vehicles was only a small part of what needed to be fixed. The bigger problems, the institutional blindness, the resistance to inconvenient truths, the tendency to punish people for being right at the wrong time, those problems were beyond the reach of technical solutions. Tomorrow, the convoy will depart with reliable communication equipment. Aina would return to the motor pool to work on the next broken vehicle. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she would continue analyzing threats and vulnerabilities that no one wanted her to think about anymore. The sun was setting behind the western hills as Aina reached her quarters. Another day complete, another problem solved, another small demonstration that competence could persist even in the face of institutional disapproval. But in the growing darkness beyond the base perimeter, other kinds of problems were being planned by people who understood that the most effective attacks targeted not just soldiers, but the leaders who made decisions about soldiers' lives. Aina would sleep well tonight, satisfied with her work on the communication systems. But her dreams would be filled with terrain analysis and blast calculations, with secondary devices and target selection principles, with knowledge that she hoped she would never need to use again. The emergency alert system at forward operating base meridian pierced the pre-dawn silence at 0347 hours. 3 sharp blasts from the base alarm, followed by the crackling voice of the duty officer over the loudspeaker system. All personnel to alert stations. Repeat, all personnel to alert stations. This is not a drill. Aina jerked awake in her bunk, instantly alert despite having been asleep for less than 4 hours. Around her, the transient quarters erupted into controlled chaos as soldiers grabbed equipment and moved toward assigned positions. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across faces tight with sudden tension. She dressed quickly in her work uniform, muscle memory guiding her movements as her mind processed the possible reasons for a base-wide alert. Equipment failure at a critical facility. Intelligence reports of imminent attack. Casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. In her previous role as an EOD specialist, she would have been among the first personnel notified of any explosive-related emergency. Now, she had no assigned alert station, no specific role in the base emergency response plan. According to official Manning documents, Aina Delacroix was motor pool personnel with no security clearance and no specialized skills relevant to crisis situations. She made her way toward the motor pool anyway, reasoning that emergency situations often created increased demand for vehicle maintenance and repair services. The base was fully illuminated now, with security teams visible on rooftops and guard towers. Military police vehicles moved rapidly between buildings, their emergency lights cutting through the darkness. At the motor pool, Aina found Chief Warrant Officer Vance standing beside a field telephone, speaking in the clipped, urgent tones that indicated serious problems requiring immediate solutions. The conversation was one-sided from Aina's perspective, but Vance's responses painted a clear picture of the developing crisis. Understood. How many casualties? Roger, we can have 2 recovery vehicles ready in 15 minutes. What about medical evacuation? Copy that. Stand by. Vance hung up the phone and turned to find Aina standing nearby. For a moment, surprise flickered across her face, then gave way to something that looked like relief. Delacroix. Good. I need you operational immediately. Vance moved toward the vehicle bay, gesturing for Aina to follow. Convoy hit an IED approximately 12 kilometers northeast of base. Initial reports indicate multiple casualties and at least 2 vehicles disabled. Aina felt her stomach tighten. The convoy that had departed yesterday morning with the armored Humvee she'd repaired. The mission she'd conducted unauthorized reconnaissance for during her test drive. The route she'd mentally cataloged for potential ambush positions and explosive device emplacement sites. Recovery mission? She asked. Recovery and medical evacuation. But we've got problems. Vance stopped beside 2 M88 recovery vehicles, massive tracked machines designed to retrieve disabled tanks and armored vehicles from battlefield conditions. Both recovery vehicles are experiencing mechanical issues. Johnson's been working on them since midnight, but he can't get consistent power to the winch systems. Aina looked at the recovery vehicles, noting the panels that had been removed and the diagnostic equipment scattered around both machines. Johnson was nowhere to be seen, which suggested he'd either solved the problems or given up in frustration. Where's Johnson now? Medical emergency. Started having chest pains around 0300. Medics transported him to the aid station 20 minutes ago. Vance's expression was grim. Which leaves you as our senior recovery vehicle technician. The irony wasn't lost on Aina. In a genuine emergency, institutional hierarchy collapsed and competence became the only currency that mattered. Her court-martial record and lack of security clearance were suddenly irrelevant compared to her ability to make broken machinery work when lives depended on it. She approached the first recovery vehicle and began a rapid assessment of Johnson's diagnostic work. The winch system electrical problems appeared similar to the communication issues she'd solved on the convoy escort vehicle. Intermittent power loss caused by electromagnetic interference between systems. But these machines were older, with less sophisticated electrical systems and more potential points of failure. How long do I have? Aina asked. Convoys under sporadic fire from an elevated position. They've got wounded who need immediate evacuation, and 2 vehicles that can't move under their own power. Vance checked her watch. Air support is 20 minutes out, but the extraction team needs these recovery vehicles operational to pull the disabled equipment and casualties out of the impact zone. 20 minutes. Aina had 20 minutes to diagnose and repair electrical problems on 2 complex military vehicles, problems that had stumped another experienced technician for several hours. Under normal circumstances it would be impossible. But these weren't normal circumstances. She grabbed her toolkit and began working on the first recovery vehicle, moving with the focused intensity that had once made her one of the most effective EOD specialists in the theater. The winch system drew power from the main electrical bus through a series of relays and control circuits. Johnson had tested the obvious components, but Aina suspected the problem lay in the interaction between multiple systems operating simultaneously. As she worked, radio traffic from the convoy position crackled through speakers in the motor pool. The voices were professional, controlled, but Aina could hear the underlying tension of soldiers under fire while trying to care for wounded comrades. Bravo 6, this is Eagle 2. We've got 3 urgent surgical and 2 priority casualties. Need immediate extraction. Eagle 2, Bravo 6. Recovery vehicles en route. Estimate 15 minutes to your position. Aina increased her pace. 15 minutes meant the recovery vehicles had to be operational in the next few minutes to maintain the timeline. She traced the electrical fault to a grounding issue similar to what she'd found on the convoy escort vehicle, but more complex because the recovery vehicle's winch system had multiple ground points that could create electromagnetic interference loops. The solution required rewiring 3 separate ground circuits and installing additional shielding around the control relays, normally a 2-hour job. Aina completed it in 12 minutes, testing each circuit as she worked to ensure proper function. Vehicle 1 operational, she called to Vance, who was coordinating with the base operations center through multiple radio channels. Aina moved immediately to the second recovery vehicle, where Johnson's diagnostic notes indicated similar symptoms but different potential causes. This machine was older, with more improvised modifications accumulated over years of field repairs. The electrical system resembled a patchwork of solutions that had solved immediate problems without considering long-term compatibility. She followed the power distribution from the main bus to the winch motor, discovering that someone had installed an aftermarket relay box that wasn't properly isolated from the vehicle's communication systems. Every time the winch engaged, it created electromagnetic pulses that reset the vehicle's radio equipment and interfered with the electrical controls. The fix required bypassing the aftermarket relay and installing a direct power feed to the winch motor. Aina worked without pause, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind calculated timing and consequences. Wounded soldiers were depending on these machines. The margin for error was 0. Vehicle 2 operational, she announced. Closing the electrical panel and grabbing cleaning rags to wipe grease from her hands, Vance appeared beside her, wearing a combination of relief and something that looked like newfound respect. Both vehicles tested and ready for deployment? Both vehicles are tested and ready, Aina confirmed. Recommend testing winch systems under load before departure, but electrical problems are resolved. No time for load testing. The recovery team is mounting up now. Vance handed Aina a radio headset. I need you to monitor their progress from here. If they experience any equipment failures during the recovery operation, you'll be our only source of immediate technical support. Aina accepted the headset, understanding that she was being integrated into the emergency response, despite her official status as punishment detail motor pool personnel. In crisis situations, competence trumped bureaucracy, and Vance was pragmatic. Enough to use whatever resources were available. The recovery vehicles departed the motor pool with full crews, their track drives churning dust as they accelerated toward the main gate. Aina monitored their radio communications while simultaneously reviewing technical manuals for both vehicles, preparing to provide troubleshooting support if mechanical problems developed during the mission. As the recovery team moved toward the convoy position, Aina found herself thinking about the terrain she'd observed during her unauthorized test drive. The route to the convoy position passed through several areas that she'd identified as potential ambush sites. Rolling hills that provided concealment for observation posts. Narrow valleys that channeled vehicle movement into predictable patterns. She opened her notebook and sketched the route from memory, marking potential threat locations and calculating timing for various tactical scenarios. It was an analysis she wasn't authorized to conduct, but Aina had learned that authorization often mattered less than accuracy when lives were at stake. Recovery 1. Base operations. Approaching checkpoint Alpha. No contact observed. Base operations. Recovery 1. Continue to checkpoint Bravo. Maintain security posture. Aina followed the recovery team's progress on her hand-drawn map, noting their timing and comparing it to her estimates for potential threat scenarios. The convoy had been hit at a location she'd identified as ideal for command-detonated explosives. A narrow passage between rock formations that limited maneuver options and provided concealment for triggermen. But something about the timing bothered her. I'd attacks typically occurred during morning hours when visibility was good and traffic patterns were predictable. This attack had happened in pre-dawn darkness, which suggested either poor planning by the attackers or deliberate timing designed to achieve specific tactical objectives. Recovery 1, Eagle 2, we have a visual on your position. Be advised, disabled vehicles are located in potential secondary device areas. Recommend EOD sweep before recovery operations. Aina's blood chilled. Secondary devices were the signature of sophisticated attackers who understood military response patterns. The primary IED disabled vehicles and created casualties, drawing rescue teams into a predetermined kill zone where secondary explosives were positioned to target the responders. Eagle 2, Recovery 1, negative on EOD assets. No EOD personnel available for immediate deployment. The radio traffic continued, but Aina was no longer listening to individual transmissions. Her mind was processing tactical scenarios and technical requirements, calculating blast effects and analyzing terrain features that she'd observed during her test drive. She knew exactly where secondary devices would be positioned if she were planning this attack. The rock formations provided multiple concealment options for command-detonated explosives. The narrow valley limited escape routes for vehicles caught in the kill zone. The timing suggested attackers who had studied American response procedures and planned accordingly. Aina walked to the base operations map display, a large-scale tactical chart that showed current positions for all friendly forces in the area. The recovery vehicles were represented by blue symbols moving toward the convoy position. The disabled vehicles were marked with red symbols, indicating casualties and equipment damage. But what caught Aina's attention was the pattern of recent incidents in the area. 3 IED attacks in the past month, all following similar tactical patterns, all targeting convoy routes during specific time periods, all resulting in disabled vehicles that required recovery operations. Someone was studying American tactical responses and planning increasingly sophisticated attacks designed to target not just initial convoys, but the rescue teams that responded to help them. It was a campaign of tactical learning that suggested highly organized opponents with significant technical expertise. Recovery 1, Eagle 2. Approaching disabled vehicles now. Request clearance to begin recovery operations. Aina grabbed a pen and began calculating blast radii for various explosive weights, using terrain features from her mental map to estimate optimal placement for secondary devices. Her analysis pointed to 3 specific locations where command-detonated explosives would achieve maximum tactical effect against recovery operations. She looked at the radio handset Vance had given her, then at the tactical map showing recovery vehicles approaching what could be a carefully prepared kill zone. Aina faced a choice that would define not just this moment, but potentially the rest of her military career. She could remain silent, staying within her assigned role as motor pool personnel, with no authority to provide tactical advice. Or she could share analysis based on skills she wasn't supposed to possess anymore, potentially saving lives, but certainly creating questions about how a demoted soldier had developed such detailed understanding of enemy tactics. Recovery 1, this is Motor Pool Base, Aina transmitted, using her radio call sign for the first time in months. Be advised, I have terrain analysis that indicates potential secondary device locations at your current position. Silence on the radio, then Chief Warrant Officer Vance's voice, tight with tension. Motor Pool Base, explain your analysis. Aina took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either vindicate her decision to speak up or confirm everyone's assessment that she was a troublemaker who couldn't follow orders. Recovery 1. Recommend halt operations and establish overwatch positions on elevated terrain before approaching disabled vehicles. Terrain features indicate 3 optimal locations for command-detonated secondary devices targeting recovery. Operations, more silence. Aina could hear background conversations in the operations center, probably officers debating whether to trust tactical analysis from someone who'd been court-martialed for insubordination. Finally, the recovery team leaders' voice came through the radio. Motor Pool Base, specify locations for potential secondary devices. Aina consulted her notebook and provided precise coordinates for the 3 positions where she calculated secondary explosives would be most effective. Her analysis was based on blast effect calculations, terrain observation, and understanding of tactical principles that she'd learned during her EOD training. Recovery 1 copies coordinates, establishing overwatch positions as recommended. The next 20 minutes passed in tense silence as the recovery team moved into positions that provided observation of the potential secondary device locations. Aina monitored their radio traffic while continuing to analyze the tactical situation and calculate alternatives if her assessment proved correct. At 0627 hours, one of the overwatch positions reported movement near the disabled convoy vehicles. Recovery 1, Overwatch 2, visual on 2 individuals approaching disabled vehicles from concealed positions, approximately 400 meters from the recovery team location. Aina felt her stomach drop. Her analysis had been correct. Secondary devices were positioned exactly where she'd calculated they would be, and the attackers were preparing to detonate them as soon as recovery operations began. Overwatch 2, engage targets immediately, came the response from the recovery team leader. Radio crackled with reports of contact as the Overwatch team engaged the secondary device triggerman. Aina listened to the tactical traffic while calculating timing and distances, trying to determine whether the recovery operation could proceed safely or whether additional threats remained in the area. Recovery 1, Overwatch 2, targets neutralized. Recommend EOD sweep of secondary device locations before proceeding with recovery operations. But there were no EOD assets available. The base's explosive ordnance disposal team was deployed to another sector and wouldn't return for several hours. The wounded convoy personnel couldn't wait that long for evacuation. Aina looked at Chief Warrant Officer Vance, who was monitoring the radio traffic with an expression of growing concern. Without EOD support, the recovery mission would have to be aborted, leaving wounded soldiers in a potentially compromised position while additional resources were marshaled. Chief, Aina said quietly, I can provide EOD support for the recovery operation. Vance turned to stare at her. You're not authorized for EOD operations. Your clearance was revoked after the court-martial. My knowledge wasn't revoked, Aina replied. Just my authorization to use it. The conversation that followed would determine whether Aina Delacruz remained a motor pool mechanic assigned to punishment duty, or whether she would have the opportunity to use her specialized skills to save lives in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. But as radio reports continued to arrive from the convoy position, describing wounded soldiers and disabled vehicles in an area potentially filled with explosive devices, Aina knew that bureaucratic concerns about authorization were about to become secondary to operational necessity. The crisis was escalating beyond the capacity of standard procedures to address. Soon, someone would have to choose between following regulations and saving lives. Aina had made that choice once before, and it had cost her everything. Now she was being asked to make it again under circumstances where the stakes were even higher and the consequences of being wrong could be measured in American casualties. The radio crackled with another transmission from the convoy position. Recovery 1, Eagle 2. We have one urgent surgical casualty who won't survive transport delay. Need immediate evacuation. Aina looked at Vance, then at the radio handset in her hands. Somewhere 12 kilometers away, wounded soldiers were depending on decisions being made by people who had never been trained to balance institutional authority against moral responsibility. But Aina had been trained for exactly that balance. And despite everything that had happened to her career, she was about to discover whether that training had prepared her for the most important decision of her life. The operations center at Forward Operating Base Meridian had transformed into a nerve center of controlled urgency. Multiple radio channels carried overlapping traffic from the convoy position, recovery teams and air support assets converging on the crisis zone. Digital displays showed friendly force positions, casualty reports, and weather conditions that could affect evacuation operations. Colonel Marcus Hartwell stood at the center of it all, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of tactical screens, as he processed information from multiple sources simultaneously. At 53, he was a veteran of 4 combat deployments who had learned to make life or death decisions with incomplete information and insufficient resources, but this situation was testing even his considerable experience. Sir, medical reports 1 urgent surgical, 2 priority, and 3 routine casualties, reported Major Sandra Kim, the operations officer coordinating the emergency response. Urgent surgery needs evacuation within the next 20 minutes or we risk losing him. Hartwell studied the tactical display showing the convoy position. The disabled vehicles were located in terrain that limited helicopter landing options and exposed any rescue operation to potential ambush from elevated positions. Worse, intelligence reports suggested the area might contain secondary explosive devices designed to target rescue teams. "What's the status of EOD support?" he asked. "Negative on immediate EOD availability, sir. Team Alpha is committed to a disposal operation in Sector 7. Estimated return time 4 hours. Team Bravo is conducting training at the range complex. Could be recalled, but transport time would be 90 minutes minimum." 90 minutes was unacceptable. The urgent surgical casualty would be dead long before EOD assets could arrive to clear potential explosive devices from the recovery area. Hartwell faced the classic military dilemma, balancing acceptable risk against mission requirements when both options carried the potential for catastrophic consequences. "Sir," came a voice from the communications section. "Recovery team leader is requesting permission to proceed with evacuation operations without EOD clearance. Says they can't wait for explosive ordnance disposal and still save the urgent surgery." Hartwell closed his eyes for a moment, weighing options that all involved unacceptable risk. Proceed without EOD support and potentially lose the entire recovery team to secondary devices. Wait for EOD support and definitely lose the urgent surgical casualty to time delays. Either choice could result in American deaths that might have been prevented. "Sir," Major Kim said quietly, "there might be another option." Hartwell looked at her expectantly. Motor pool personnel reported that they have someone with EOD experience on base. Individual who provided the terrain analysis that identified the secondary device positions. "What kind of EOD experience?" Kim consulted her notes. Former EOD specialist. 3 years field experience, including advanced training in secondary device analysis and disposal. Court-martialed 6 months ago for insubordination, currently assigned to motor pool maintenance duty. Hartwell felt his jaw tighten. He knew about Aina Delacroix's case, had reviewed the court-martial proceedings when he assumed command of the base. Her refusal to sign an ordnance disposal report had been technically insubordinate, but subsequent events had proven her assessment correct. She'd been punished for being right in a way that embarrassed her commanding officer. Current security. Clearance status. Clearance revoked following court-martial. No authorization for explosive ordnance disposal operations. But she has the technical knowledge and field experience? According to her personnel file, yes, sir. And her terrain analysis. Today was accurate enough to save the recovery team from ambush. Hartwell stared at the tactical display, watching blue symbols representing American soldiers in a position where they needed help he couldn't provide through authorized channels. The urgent surgical casualty was represented by a red symbol pulsing slowly on the screen, each pulse marking time running out. Get her up here, he decided. I want to talk to her directly. 5 minutes later, Aina Delacroix stood at attention in the operations center, her motor pool uniform incongruous among the digital displays and sophisticated communication equipment. She wore no rank insignia, carried no specialized gear, and, according to official records, had no business being in a facility that required security clearance for access. But Hartwell had learned to judge people by competence rather than credentials, and Aina's bearing suggested someone who understood the gravity of the situation without being intimidated by it. Her eyes moved briefly across the tactical displays, taking in information about friendly positions and threat assessments with the quick comprehension of someone trained to process battlefield data. Specialist Delacroix, Hartwell began then. Caught himself. Aina had been reduced in rank following her court-martial. Aina, I understand you have explosive ordnance disposal experience. Yes, sir. 3 years field experience, including secondary device analysis and urban disposal operations. And you believe you can provide EOD support for the recovery mission? Aina looked directly at him, her expression serious but not hesitant. I can provide technical assessment and disposal recommendations for secondary devices, sir. Can't guarantee authorization to conduct actual disposal operations. Hartwell appreciated the honesty. Aina wasn't overselling her capabilities or making promises she couldn't keep. She was accurately stating what she could contribute while acknowledging the limitations of her current status. The recovery team has identified 3 potential secondary device locations based on your terrain analysis, he continued. What would you need to assess and potentially neutralize those devices? Visual reconnaissance of the positions. Basic. Explosive ordnance disposal kit. Radio communication with the recovery team for coordination. Aina paused. And unofficial authorization to operate outside my current assignment parameters. The last point was the crucial one. Hartwell could provide equipment and communication support, but what Aina was really asking for was permission to violate the restrictions that had been placed on her following the court-martial. Permission to use skills that she wasn't officially authorized to possess anymore. Major Kim, Hartwell said without taking his eyes off Aina. What's our liability exposure if I authorize unauthorized personnel to conduct explosive ordnance disposal operations? Significant, sir. Both for you personally and for base operations. If something goes wrong, it becomes a command responsibility issue. And if I don't authorize it? We lost the urgent surgical casualty, sir. Possibly others if the delay compromises the entire evacuation. Hartwell had faced similar decisions before, moments where regulations conflicted with operational necessity and commanders had to choose between covering themselves and accomplishing the mission. The military promoted officers who followed procedures, but it needed leaders who could make hard choices when procedures weren't adequate. "Aina," he said finally, "I need your honest assessment. Can you safely assess and neutralize secondary explosive devices at the convoy position?" "I can assess them, sir." "Neutralization depends on device type and emplacement characteristics. Won't know for certain until I examine the positions. Best case scenario? Remote disposal using available ordnance if devices are conventional IEDs, with accessible trigger mechanisms. Time requirement approximately 30 minutes per device. Worst case scenario?" Aina hesitated, and Hartwell knew she was considering whether to provide a reassuring answer or an honest one. Complex devices requiring manual approach and disarmament. Significant risk to disposal personnel. Time requirement potentially hours. Per device. Hartwell nodded. Aina wasn't minimizing the risks or promising easy solutions. She was providing professional assessment based on technical knowledge and field experience. Exactly what he needed to make an informed decision. "Sir," came a voice from the radio section. "Recovery team leader reports urgent surgical casualty is becoming unstable. Medical personnel estimate 15 minutes maximum before the condition becomes non-survivable." 15 minutes. Hartwell looked at the tactical display, at the convoy position where wounded soldiers were depending on decisions being made by people they would never meet. He thought about Aina's court-martial, about institutional preferences for compliance over competence, about the difference between following orders and doing the right thing. "Aina," he said, "I'm going to ask you to do something that officially I can't authorize and unofficially I can't order. I need you to deploy to the convoy position and provide explosive ordnance disposal support for the evacuation operation. You'll be operating without official authorization, using skills that you're not currently cleared to employ, in a situation where failure could result in American casualties." Aina's expression didn't change. "I understand, sir. If you succeed, there will be no official recognition. Your contribution won't appear in any reports. You'll return to motor pool duty tomorrow morning as if this never happened." "Yes, sir." "If you fail, or if something goes wrong, I'll take full responsibility. But your career will be over, completely and permanently." Aina looked at him steadily. "My career was over 6 months ago, sir." "This isn't about career advancement. Then what is it about?" "Doing the job I was trained to do when people need it." "Done." Hartwell felt something shift in the operations center. Conversations had stopped as personnel listened to the exchange between a colonel and a demoted specialist discussing whether institutional authority mattered more than mission accomplishment. It was the kind of moment that defined leadership and revealed character under pressure. "Major Kim," Hartwell said, "coordinated helicopter transport for Aina to the convoy position. Provide standard EOD kit and communication equipment. Ensure the recovery team leader is briefed on her arrival and support requirements." "Sir, official authorization?" "There is no official authorization. This is an emergency operational decision based on available resources and mission requirements. Log it as command discretion under combat conditions." Kim nodded and began coordinating the deployment. Around the operations center, personnel returned to their duties with a new understanding that their commanding officer was willing to take personal responsibility for unconventional decisions when conventional options weren't adequate. Aina started to leave, then paused. "Sir, one more thing. The attack pattern suggests enemy forces have been studying our response procedures. They know how we conduct recovery operations, what equipment we use, how long our timelines are. This isn't random harassment. It's tactical. Preparation for something larger." Hartwell studied her. "Explain." 3 similar attacks in the past month, all targeting convoy routes, all during specific time periods when recovery operations would be predictable. They're learning our patterns and capabilities. Today's attack was designed to test our EAD response time and procedures. You think this is reconnaissance for a larger operation? I think someone is planning an attack specifically designed to target recovery teams and medical evacuation operations. Today was practice. The implications were sobering. If Aina was correct, the enemy wasn't just conducting isolated attacks on convoys. They were developing the intelligence and tactical knowledge necessary to target American emergency response capabilities systematically. How confident are you in that assessment? Aina considered the question carefully. Confident enough to recommend that future recovery operations include enhanced security measures and alternative response patterns. Not confident enough to base major operational decisions on the analysis. Again, Hartwell appreciated her honesty. Aina was sharing professional concerns without overselling her conclusions or demanding action beyond what the evidence supported. We'll discuss threat assessment when you return, he decided. Right now, focus on getting our people out of there safely. Aina nodded and headed toward the door, then stopped once more. Sir, there's something else. The recovery vehicles I repaired. This morning, I installed additional electromagnetic shielding that should protect them against radio-controlled devices. But if the enemy has adapted to our countermeasures, they might be using wire-detonated or timer-activated devices instead. Meaning the electronic countermeasures that usually protect our vehicles might not be effective against the devices I'm going to encounter. I could be walking into a situation where standard protective measures don't apply. Hartwell realized that Aina was providing him with information that could change his decision about authorizing her deployment. She was giving him reasons to reconsider, opportunities to find alternative solutions that didn't involve sending unauthorized personnel into extreme danger. That it was exactly the kind of integrity that had gotten her court-martialed in the first place. The willingness to provide complete information, even when it complicated decisions and challenged authority preferences. Aina Delacruz told the truth regardless of consequences, and the truth was often inconvenient for people who preferred simple answers to complex problems. Aina, Hartwell said finally, are you volunteering for this mission, or am I ordering you to accept it? Volunteering, sir. This is my choice. Then go make it count. As Aina left the operations center, Hartwell turned to Major Kim. Get me a secure line to division. I want to discuss threat assessment and response patterns with intelligence personnel. If she's right about enemy tactical development, we need to adjust our procedures before they're tested in a larger engagement. And if she's wrong, then we've lost nothing by being more careful. But if she's right and we ignore the warning, we could lose a lot more than one urgent surgical casualty. The helicopter carrying Aina toward the convoy position lifted off at 647 hours, its rotors churning dust across the motor pool where she'd spent the past 6 months fixing vehicles and being reminded that her career was over. Now she was flying toward the most dangerous mission of her military service, authorized by a colonel who was risking his own career to give her the chance to use skills that regulations said she didn't possess anymore. In the operations center, Hartwell watched the helicopter's progress on tactical displays while monitoring radio traffic from the convoy position. The urgent surgical casualty was still alive, still waiting for evacuation that depended on someone else's willingness to walk into a potential minefield and make split-second decisions that could save lives or end them. For the first time since taking command of Forward Operating Base Meridian, Colonel Marcus Hartwell had authorized a mission that he couldn't control, couldn't predict, and couldn't take back once it began. The success or failure of the operation depended entirely on the competence and courage of a soldier who had been labeled unreliable by an institution that valued compliance over character. But as he watched the blue symbol representing Aina's helicopter move toward the red symbols marking wounded soldiers, Hartwell realized that some decisions couldn't be made by committees or justified by regulations. Sometimes leadership meant trusting people who had proven their integrity, even when that integrity had cost them everything else. The radio crackled with an update from the convoy position. Base operations, Recovery 1, helicopter inbound with EOD support, standing by for disposal operations. Hartwell picked up the microphone. Recovery 1, base operations. EOD specialist has full authority for device assessment and disposal. Coordinate directly with her for tactical requirements. It was the closest he could come to official authorization without actually providing it. Aina would operate with command support, but without institutional protection. If everything went well, she would return to motor pool duty with no recognition for her contribution. If things went badly, she would face the consequences alone. But for the next hour, Aina Delacruz would have the opportunity to prove that competence and character mattered more than rank and regulations. And Colonel Hartwell would discover whether his faith in unconventional solutions was justified or catastrophically misplaced. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter descended through morning air, thick with dust and tension, its rotors beating against thermals rising from the desert floor. Aina sat in the cargo compartment, checking her borrowed explosive ordnance disposal kit one final time. The equipment was standard military issue: multimeter, wire cutters, remote rendering device, various tools for accessing and disarming improvised explosive devices. What wasn't standard was the person using it. Through the helicopter's window, she could see the convoy position ahead. 2 disabled Humvees sat motionless on the narrow road, their hulks dark against the pale sand. Smoke still drifted from the lead vehicle where the initial IED had detonated. Around the disabled vehicles, recovery teams had established a security perimeter, but Aina knew they were positioned in a potential kill zone designed to target anyone who approached the wreckage. 2 minutes to the landing zone, the crew chief announced over the intercom. LZ is cold, but be advised we're not staying long. Too much exposure time. Aina nodded and secured her equipment. The helicopter would deliver her to the convoy position and immediately depart, leaving her to work alone in an area that might contain multiple explosive devices designed specifically to kill people. With her training and mission. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres met her at the perimeter. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested extensive experience in dangerous situations. His greeting was professional but cautious. "You're our EOD support?" he asked, studying Aina's uniform with its conspicuous lack of rank insignia. "I'm your explosive ordnance disposal consultant," Aina replied carefully. "Authorized for assessment and recommendations. Disposal operations at your discretion." Aina consulted her hand-drawn map and identified 3 potential secondary device locations. Through binoculars, she analyzed each site systematically. The elevated position showed clear signs of recent activity: disturbed soil and camouflaged wiring running toward the disabled convoy. The concealed position near the road bend was more subtle but positioned perfectly for a pressure-activated device. The natural choke point offered opportunities for multiple devices triggered in sequence. "All 3 positions show indicators of device emplacement," Aina reported. "Recommend starting with the elevated position, which appears to be command detonated with accessible wiring." "Time requirement?" Torres asked. "Depends on device sophistication. Simple devices could be rendered safe in 15 minutes each. Complex devices could require an hour or more." Aina checked her watch. Urgent surgical casualty doesn't have an hour. Aina made her tactical decision. Parallel operations. "I'll begin disposal work on the elevated position while recovery teams prepare extraction equipment." She left the security perimeter and began moving toward the elevated position, covering 200 meters of open ground in 3 minutes. As she approached the suspected device location, Aina shifted into the methodical mindset that had kept her alive during 3 years of explosive Ordnance disposal work. The elevated position revealed exactly what her analysis had predicted. A command detonated. Device consisting of military ordnance connected to a radio-controlled trigger mechanism. The explosive component was a repurposed artillery shell connected to commercially available radio equipment adapted for military purposes. Aina began the disposal process by tracing wiring from the trigger mechanism to the explosive charge. The installation was professional, but not exceptionally sophisticated. She disabled the radio receiver first, cutting power connections and removing the antenna. Then she traced the firing circuit, identifying connection points where it could be safely interrupted. The actual disposal took 12 minutes. Aina removed the detonator, separated the firing circuit, and verified that the explosive charge was no longer functional. She marked the position with orange engineer tape and transmitted her status. Position 1 cleared. Moving to position 2. The concealed position presented a different challenge. Aina's approach revealed a pressure-activated device buried beneath the roadway surface, designed to detonate when vehicles passed over a specific point. This type of device required careful excavation to expose the trigger mechanism without accidentally activating it. As she worked, radio traffic provided updates on the urgent surgical casualty's deteriorating condition. Recovery 1, medical. Reports urgent surgical casualty is deteriorating. Estimate 10 minutes maximum before condition becomes critical. Aina made a tactical decision that violated standard procedures, but addressed operational requirements. Instead of completely disarming the device, she identified the primary trigger mechanism and installed a bypass circuit that would prevent activation while leaving other components intact. The bypass installation took 6 minutes and neutralized the device operationally while minimizing time requirements. Position 2 neutralized. Recovery vehicles are clear to approach. The choke point position was the most challenging site. Aina's assessment revealed multiple devices interconnected, with a sophisticated trigger system designed to create sequential detonations. But the sophistication created vulnerability. The interconnected triggers depended on centralized timing control that could be disrupted by targeting specific components. She traced the control circuits to a central distribution box concealed among rock formations. By disconnecting the control circuits at the distribution point, Aina could neutralize all interconnected devices simultaneously. Aina moved with careful precision, accessing the distribution box while avoiding trigger wires and sensor arrays. As she worked on the control circuits, she could hear recovery vehicles approaching the disabled convoy. Aina disconnected the final control circuit at 0734 hours. The timing mechanisms went dark, the relay switches opened, and the sequential detonation capability was eliminated. Position 3 neutralized. All routes clear for extraction. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency. The urgent surgical casualty was airlifted at 0741 hours, still alive and stable enough for transport. Aina remained at the choke point position, conducting final verification that all explosive devices had been properly neutralized. The helicopter returned Aina to forward operating base Meridian at 0847 hours. She walked across the landing zone with the same measured pace she'd maintained since leaving her quarters 12 hours earlier. No one waited to greet her. No crowds gathered to celebrate. Aina preferred it that way. She returned the borrowed EOD equipment to the base armory, signing paperwork that made no reference to how the equipment had been used. At the medical facility, she learned that the urgent surgical casualty had arrived in time for life-saving surgery and was expected to make a full recovery. Information about the explosive devices was classified. Aina provided technical details to intelligence personnel, but her role in the disposal operations would not appear in any official reports. As Colonel Hartwell had promised, her contribution would remain unrecognized and officially non-existent. Chief Warrant Officer Vance appeared around midday, conducting routine oversight while Aina worked on vehicle maintenance projects. The conversation covered standard maintenance topics until Vance prepared to leave. Heard there was some excitement this morning. Convoy recovery operation, Vance mentioned casually. Heard the same thing, Aina replied neutrally. Heard it went well. All personnel accounted for, equipment recovered, casualties evacuated successfully. Vance studied her for a moment. Sometimes the best work gets done by people who don't need credit for doing it. Later that afternoon, Colonel Hartwell visited Aina's workstation, ostensibly to discuss generator repair, but actually addressing broader issues about adaptability and problem-solving. Innovation within existing parameters, Hartwell observed. Examining Aina's custom mounting bracket. Making things work when standard procedures aren't adequate. Sometimes you have to modify the approach to accomplish the mission. Aina agreed. Their technical discussion continued, but Hartwell's questions about expertise and unconventional approaches suggested her performance had been noted. As he prepared to leave, Hartwell offered a significant comment. I've been reviewing personnel assignments and considering whether some individuals might be better utilized in positions that match their actual capabilities rather than their current administrative status. Sometimes good people end up in wrong assignments because of administrative complications rather than performance issues. Sometimes those complications can be resolved if the right opportunities present themselves. Aina understood that Hartwell was indicating her court-martial record might not permanently define her career. That exceptional performance could overcome institutional prejudice. 6 months later, Aina stood in the same motor pool, but Staff Sergeant stripes had replaced the blank sleeves marking her punishment period. EOD badges reflected her restored specialty status. Most importantly, her bearing reflected someone who had learned that institutional recognition mattered less than personal integrity. The promotion ceremony had been small and private. No speeches were made about redemption or second chances. Aina's restoration was treated as correction of an administrative error rather than reward for exceptional performance. She preferred it that way. Private First Class Jennifer Walsh approached Aina's workstation, eager to learn from someone whose reputation for solving impossible problems had become legendary within the motor pool. Staff Sergeant, could you explain your approach to custom mounting solutions? I've been studying your documentation, but I'm having trouble understanding the modification principles. Aina followed Walsh to examine her current project, a power distribution problem similar to issues Aina had encountered numerous times. Walsh had been trying to implement prescribed repair procedures despite having inadequate resources. What happens if you can't get replacement components? Aina asked. Mission equipment stays down until parts arrive. Standard procedure is to wait for proper components rather than improvise solutions. And what happens to the people who depend on that equipment while you're waiting? Walsh hesitated, recognizing the fundamental tension between following procedures and accomplishing missions. They have to work without it. So your choice is between following standard procedure and ensuring people have equipment they need to do their jobs safely. Aina examined the power distribution system. What do you think matters more? The mission, obviously. But regulations exist for good reasons. Improvised solutions can create safety problems worse than the original issue. Absolutely correct. Which means improvised solutions should only be attempted by people with sufficient knowledge to implement them safely. Aina pointed to specific components. But when you have that knowledge and people depend on you to solve problems that can't be solved through standard procedures, following regulations becomes secondary to accomplishing the mission. Aina spent the next hour teaching Walsh diagnostic techniques developed through field experience. Methods for identifying problems that didn't present obvious symptoms. Approaches for implementing solutions when standard resources weren't available. The most important thing, Aina concluded, is understanding that your primary responsibility is to the people who depend on your work, not to the people who evaluate your performance. Sometimes those are the same thing, but when they're not, you choose based on professional knowledge and personal integrity. Is that what got you in trouble before? Walsh asked. Choosing mission over procedure? Aina considered the question carefully. I got in trouble for refusing to sign a report that I knew was inaccurate. My commanding officer had declared an area safe, but my analysis indicated unexploded ordnance remained. Signing the report would have followed procedure and avoided conflict. Refusing to sign was technically insubordinate, but prevented potential civilian casualties. And you were court-martialed for being right? I was court-martialed for refusing to follow orders. Whether the first was right became irrelevant once I prioritized professional assessment over military authority. Aina paused. The lesson isn't that being right protects you from consequences. The lesson is that some consequences are worth accepting when the alternative is compromising integrity or endangering people who trust your expertise. Chief Warrant Officer Vance approached carrying a folder containing orders for temporary duty assignment to a specialized EOD unit. The assignment involved training other specialists in advanced secondary device analysis and disposal techniques. Teaching assignment, Vance explained. Division wants to share your expertise with units encountering increasingly sophisticated explosive devices. Your analysis of enemy tactical development has proven accurate. Aina reviewed the orders. The assignment represented significant professional recognition and career advancement, acknowledging her specialized expertise and providing opportunities to influence broader operational capabilities. I'm interested, Aina decided. But I'd like to request that Private Walsh be assigned to continue the projects I'm managing. She has the technical knowledge and motivation for increased responsibilities. As evening approached, Aina reflected on the path from court-martial to teaching. Assignment from punishment to recognition. The journey had required accepting consequences that seemed unfair, maintaining standards others questioned, and proving competence, repeatedly to people who preferred compliance over capability. But the journey had revealed that individual integrity could influence institutional culture. That personal example could inspire others to prioritize principle over convenience. That moral courage could create positive change even when it came slowly and quietly. Aina had learned that competence persisted despite institutional disapproval. That skills remained valuable even when authorization was revoked. That integrity could overcome bureaucratic obstacles if demonstrated consistently over time. Most importantly, she'd learned that the people who mattered most were rarely those who made personnel decisions. The people who mattered were wounded soldiers who needed evacuation from dangerous areas, young technicians who needed guidance solving complex problems, teammates who depended on reliable equipment and accurate analysis when lives were at stake. Aina Delacroix had never asked for recognition and had never needed it. Her satisfaction came from problems solved, lives saved, and knowledge shared with people who would use it to help others. She had proven that one person's commitment to integrity could influence an entire organization's understanding of what mattered most. Her story demonstrated that steady competence applied consistently over time could overcome institutional prejudice. That moral courage could survive bureaucratic punishment. That the most important victories were often invisible to people who kept score. For anyone who had ever been underestimated for being steady, overlooked for being principled, or dismissed for refusing to compromise their standards, Aina's example showed that integrity was not weakness but strength. That doing the right thing was worth doing even when it cost everything else. The most valuable contributions were frequently unrecognized by those who wrote performance reports, but they were never forgotten by those whose lives they touched. Aina had learned that true leadership was not about volume but about vision, not about seeking credit but about accepting responsibility. Not about following the crowd, but about standing alone when standing alone was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.